Morning. It is time to begin our Bible study this morning. Good to have those out with us this morning. Good to have those that are following along on Facebook as well. My name is Daniel Sanders, preacher for the Quail Valley Church of Christ, and we are continuing in our Bible study this morning, looking at the book of Acts. We are in Acts chapter 16 this morning, and we'll begin that study here in just a few moments. And before we begin, Brother Jesse, would you mind leading us in a word of prayer this morning?
I can do that.
All right, appreciate that.
Our all-wise and merciful Heavenly Father, we thank thee for every blessing that we have. We thank you for we have this comfortable place to sit and study thy word and worship and pray to God. Continue to bless and protect us and keep us safe and do us the things we need. Keep the family safe and keep this country safe. Continue to bless us in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. So again, Acts chapter 16 is where we are beginning this morning. Last week we were beginning to look at some of the different verses here in chapter 16, looking at verse 1 down to verse 5. Talking about the strengthening of the churches. And the strengthening of the churches took place. We look, Paul was leaving Jerusalem, going up into Antioch of Syria, eventually going into Cilicia, here in Acts chapter 16. And as we look, they continued on into Lystra, Derbe, Iconium region, in that region of Galatia, places that they had continued to visit. And they had, as well as we look, they had Timothy accompany them on this trip. And we learn a little bit about Timothy. And Timothy is one that is a young evangelist and one that Paul was also kind of took under his wing as we look at his letters to first and second, his two letters to Timothy that we have record of. We see him giving some words of encouragement and instruction. From there, we look as they had continued on from Lystra, Iconium, and Derbe, kind of going up into just around Asia or Galatia here, into Bithynia and Pontus. As we look in Acts chapter 16, verse 6 down to verse 10, again, they had continued up to this point. They had been forbidden by the Holy Spirit to go into different areas because it was not that time. As we look at this, there were some other things that were eventually going to happen. And as we look here in this part of Acts chapter 16, verse 6 down to verse 10, it is here where Paul receives the vision to go into Macedonia. And as we look up here into this upper region of Europe, north of Greece and everything, and he receives a vision saying, come to us. Come to us. The Gospels need to be taught. So as we look, Paul begins to make that trip from Bithynia over across into the northern part of Asia, going into Samothrace, and as well as we look Neapolis, and eventually getting into Philippi. And that's where we stopped off last week. We are looking here in Acts chapter 16 and looking at verse 11 down to verse 15 in particular. First of all, because we have two conversion accounts here in Acts chapter 16. Paul spent some time with the brethren of Philippi. We'll talk a little bit about this as well as we have this time and opportunity today. Again, Paul sails from Troas, as we look here, into Philippi. And let's just go ahead and we'll read verse 11, beginning there in Acts chapter 16, and we'll read down to verse 15 here this morning first. It says here, therefore, sailing from Troas, we ran a straight course to Samothrace, and the next day came to Neapolis. From there to Philippi, which is the foremost city of that part of Macedonia, a colony. And we were staying in that city for some days. And on the Sabbath, we went down out of the city to the riverside where prayer was customarily made. We sat down and spoke to the women who met there. Now a certain woman named Lydia heard us. She was a seller of purple from the city of Thyatira who worshiped God. The Lord opened her heart to heed the things spoken by Paul. When she and her household were baptized, she begged us, saying, if you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come to my house and stay. So she persuaded us. So again, as we look here, we get into the conversion accounts. The first one that we read here is of Lydia. But before we talk about that, let's just briefly, we talk about Philippi for a few moments. Philippi, first place that we have record of Paul going into Europe. In his missionary trips, it's the first stop, we could say, going into a modern-day Europe. I know some people will say, well, isn't Turkey part of Europe, or is it part of Asia? We're going to go this way with it, saying this was his first area of going into Europe. And so as we look, Paul travels here. Philippi is about 9 miles north from the Aegean Sea and the Aegean coast, and a local port of Neapolis as well as we look here. Philippi had inhabitants of Thracians, Greek, Roman descent, a very heavily populated area of those types of individuals, especially being closer to Rome. You're going to have a larger Roman influence, of course, as we look in Europe, because Rome was the, quote, the proverbial ruling power at this point in time, the kind of the top nation ruling at this point. And as we look, Philippi was a center of various deities. Again, there were different gods that were worshipped, and Paul also has a good relationship, a personal relationship with the brethren here in establishing the church, helping the church continue to grow. Paul arrives around the year AD 49 or 50 is what the estimate time is with this, during the reign of Claudius. And Paul spends time in his ministry. Again, he has a love for these brethren. As we look at, he has a lot of good things to say. If you look at the Philippian letter that he writes, and he goes on talking about how they were to have that mind of Christ. He's writing to individuals there. As we know about the church, we know that the church there had bishops and deacons, elders and deacons, as we look at the very opening of that letter in Philippians chapter 1. And again, Paul continues to help individuals grow and helps to, continue to convert individuals. Lydia, her household, Philippian jailer, his household. And again, we see some of the different things that Paul has to write in concerning the brethren there. So again, we look and see just a little bit of background about Philippi. And as we look, Paul encounters people on the Sabbath. And at this point, in this particular case, Paul, he goes where the people would be at. In a lot of cases, he would he would be in the synagogue in most cases. But as we look here, he goes where the people are, and in this case, they're there at the riverside, where prayer was customarily made. And again, he speaks to the women here on this matter. So they go here, they go to the women, they had religious conversations with these individuals. You can look at 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 2 down to verse 5, about Paul is instructing Timothy to preach the word, be ready in season, out of season, to have that conversation. Why? Because people were turning to different gods, idolatry, different types of religious entities. Paul's having a religious conversation about God with the women here and with others here. If you look in Philippians chapter 1, real quick, just keep your thumb marked here in Acts 16. But in Philippians chapter 1, and we consider verse 3. Philippians chapter 1, beginning with verse 3. Philippians 1, beginning with verse 3, it says, I thank my God upon every remembrance of you, always in every prayer of mine making request for you with all joy, for your fellowship in the gospel from the first day until now, being confident of this very thing, that he who has begun a good work in you will complete it until the day of Jesus Christ. Just as it is right for me to think this of you all, because I have you in my heart, inasmuch as both in my chains and the defense of the confirmation of the gospel, you are partakers with me of grace. For God is my witness, how greatly I long for you all with the affection of Jesus Christ. This I pray, that your love may abound still more and more in knowledge and all discernment, that you may approve the things that are excellent, that you may be sincere without offense till the day of Christ, being filled with the first fruits of righteousness, which are by Jesus Christ, to the glory and praise of God. Now, if you notice with me the conversation that Paul has? He's got nothing but good things to say about these brethren in Philippi. He continues to encourage them. He says, verse 5, from the first day, your fellowship from the first day that we have record of is right here when he gets there and goes to the riverside, begins preaching. Until now, their continuation of the gospel. They have been involved in good works. They have been involved in keeping that love for God. These individuals Paul had spoken to, had conversation with, had preached the gospel to. And as we look later on, they are remembered for their continuation and their faithfulness to God and that love that they had for the Lord and for the brethren. Now that love as well gets extended to Paul, and he remembers them quite well for their generosity in helping him in preaching and teaching the gospel as well. But as we look this conversation, in particular, there's one that's mentioned here in Acts chapter 16, and looking at verse 14 together here this morning, is that we have Lydia. What do we know about Lydia?
She was a business lady. It's okay to work.
It's okay to work. Got a bit. She was a seller of purple out of Thyatira. What is that? It's significant to a certain extent. What does purple represent? Royalty.
It was a very expensive dye.
Mm-hmm. And only the higher royalty individuals, the nobles, we could say nobles as well, it's kind of, they were the ones that wore purple. We know that for sure. That again, it signifies royalty. We could look at a reference. What did they clothe Jesus with when he was crucified? Purple robe. And what did they say? Hail, King of the Jews. When they put the purple robe on, put the crown of thorns on his head, put the reed in his hand, they were trying, they were mocking him, but again, signifying royalty and such. So Lydia, the seller of purple, she's out of Thyatira. As we look, let me go. So I've got Thyatira right here in the middle of Asia. We will reference Thyatira later on in the churches, letters to the Church of Asia Minor. There in Revelation 2 and 3, that's one of the churches that's mentioned there later on. But Lydia is from this area. But we also know that she was one who worshiped God. And the Lord opened her heart to the things that Paul had to present to her. So again, we see that there was this heart that was already within her, that she was worshiping God. She had a desire to worship God. She listens to what Paul has to say. And as we look, when she and her household were baptized, she begged us, saying, if you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come to my house and stay. So she persuaded us. One of the things that we will take note of, not only both accounts here in Acts chapter 16 in Philippi, but in other accounts, when we read about an individual, is that they bring Paul or bring whoever's preaching the gospel to their household. And we see that others within that household receive the gospel. And what I want to think about, just looking at this, is the influence that we have on others goes a long way. When we have something maybe happen to us and we want others to be able to experience it, who would be the first ones we would normally go to? Family, close friends, maybe friends that are like brothers that we read over in Proverbs. But we see the influence that we have of wanting others. So we go to our family. In the case of there in the book of John, we read about individuals going to their cousins with Nathaniel and others, being able to come here, Jesus, come here, this man out of Nazareth. So again, we see the influence that we have that is impactful on others. Matthew 5:14 down to verse 16 talks about how we are a light of the world and we're not to let our light be hidden, but let it shine so that others may see our good works as we give honor and glory to our Father in heaven. So we see the importance of being able to share this with others. And Lydia, what we read in these couple verses here, is that she was a good woman, a profitable woman, a businesswoman as we look at this, but also one that was wanting what was best for her and for her family as well in receiving and hearing the gospel. And we see the results of this, that she and her household were baptized into Christ. And then as we look and conclude there, that continuation, that fellowship to have with one another, she encouraged Paul and others to be able to stay with her there at her house. And they do stay there for a little bit. Does anybody have anything they want to add? Yeah, absolutely. As we see, same situation with that. Cornelius. And Cornelius' household received the gospel through Peter. He and his household were baptized. So again, there are multiple examples of individuals. We see the one, that first, what we call the first domino to fall, and then everything kind of follows, more will follow suit with things. Here's what we see, but we can look at it in a more positive way of being able to help more turn to God in this matter. Oh, absolutely. We read about 3,000 souls that being added to the church that day, and what influence does it have? Huge influence of seeing others respond to the gospel, hearing the gospel. I need to hear it too, and we see multiple amount there on the day of Pentecost, hearing and believing and obeying the gospel, and again, those influences play a pivotal role in being able to help another one turn to God. Sometimes where you see, I can remember whenever my sister and I obeyed the gospel the same year. I was later on, but my sister was the first one. There was about 10 to 15 of us around the same age where we were going to church. And you know what happened? My sister was the first one that year to obey the gospel. There was 3 other people that I can remember of firsthand that obeyed the gospel that year before I obeyed the gospel. And so it just takes that first person, that courage, that confidence, that courage to be able to take that first step. And then you see others kind of reciprocating, want to do the same thing and obeying the gospel, and others want to try to follow, not trying to do it just because someone else did, but doing it, I understand what I need to do. And seeing someone else do it kind of gives us the encouragement and the desire if we haven't obeyed to do it ourselves.
Luke joined Paul and Silas at Troas, and so we can just sit there with Luke. We can see it.
Oh yeah.
There and saw it.
Oh yeah. Luke writing, Luke being the physician. Physicians have a tendency of paying attention. I have a little bit more OCD of paying attention to details. You can see it in his writing of paying attention to some of these details and being a little more picturesque, of being able to kind of hear and kind of put in my imagination, I could put myself there, kind of thinking about and in my imagination of being able to see these individuals responding to the gospel as well. So Luke does inspired by God, being able to do an excellent job and being able to put this all in perspective for us to be able to read and have that faith and confidence in seeking and serving God as well. Anybody else got anything so far this morning? All right, picking up with verse 16. Verse 16 of Acts chapter 16. I got some extra notes here. Acts chapter 16, beginning of verse 16. And let's just read, let me get down to verse 24 for now. Acts 16, beginning of verse 16. It says, "It happened, as he went to prayer, that a certain slave girl, possessed a spirit of divination, met us, who brought her masters much profit by fortune-telling. The girl followed Paul and us and cried out, saying, 'These men are the servants of the Most High God, who proclaim to us the way of salvation.' And this she did for many days. Paul, greatly annoyed, turned and said to the spirit, 'I command you in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her.' And he came out that very hour. But when her masters saw that their hope of profit was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace to the authorities. They brought them to the magistrates and said, 'These men, being Jews, exceedingly trouble our city. They teach customs which are not lawful for us, being Romans, to receive or observe. Then the multitude rose up against them, and the magistrates tore off their clothes and commanded them to be beaten with rods. When they had laid many stripes on them, they threw them into prison, commanding the jailer to keep them securely. Having received such a charge, he put them into the inner prison and fastened their feet in the stocks. So, what is the spirit of divination?
Fortune telling.
Fortune telling. Whether it's been, whatever it is, trying to predict things into the future. It's interesting. That has been a business that people have continued to pursue up to this day. Now, I don't think I remember seeing one here in town. Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't remember seeing a fortune teller here. We had 6 of them in Sandusky alone. 3 of them were on the main strip of town. Tarot card reading, and people have always tried to get these different things of wanting to try to have the fortune tellers tell them what's going to happen in the future. You got those fortune cookies. You like going to the Chinese restaurant, they give you those fortune cookies. I like to read some of those. It's interesting. One time, I've been to the Chinese restaurant too many times. I won't say how many because I don't know. But get those fortune cookies. There's one time in my almost 41 years of life that one fortune actually came true from one of those. I can't remember exactly what it was, but I remember I saved it for the longest time, and then, anyway. Then you have those little machines where they got the little gentleman, you put 2 quarters in, and then it'll print out a reading card for your future. It has been a business of continuation, and here in Acts chapter 16, verse 16, you've got this individual who is able to do fortune telling, being able to trying to predict future events. Now we know that that's just ludicrous. That you can't. It's hard to be able to predict the future. I know, one of the things that we have in the industry today that people like to do, that are predicting the future. And I'm not trying to bash them, but how about the weather people? I'm not trying to, but what do? They predict what the weather is going to be like. So there is some similarities of different things of people trying to. Sometimes they get those right. Sometimes, anyway. So the business of these predicting future events, and in this case, you have what they called the spirit of Python, or even Apollo. Python in this was a huge serpent that had an oracle at Mount Parnassus, and again, famous for predicting future. So there's some of this background of where some of this has come into play over the centuries. But oftentimes, we see that they had failed in these different foretelling of future events. And as well, one of the other things that some people have said that came about with these spirits of divination was also ventriloquism, was another kind of side hustle of things of what people would do with people that were possessed in this way. But as we look here, they're in Philippi. This individual, this girl, had this spirit of divination. They met the girl, and again, she was profitable for whoever owned her. Again, we see she was a slave and had masters that were overseeing her and had her, and they had much profit in fortune telling. But as she has this spirit, Paul enters into the city, and she continues to cry out, "These are men of the servants of the Most High God, who proclaim the way of salvation." Now, whatever all the different things she's ever done before, she's got one thing right. She's saying one thing that's right for sure, that these people were of God, and they are bringing a message of salvation. Well, she did that over and over, and being around Paul and making that announcement over and over and over again. And it said, I don't think, does it say anything different in the King James when Paul gets annoyed, or does it say annoyed there too?
Grieved.
He was grieved, okay.
But Paul, being grieved, turned and said to the spirit, "I command thee in the name of Jesus Christ to come out."
days of having this, there was something of concern with Paul, with what this girl had continued to do. But, again, trying to focus on his work, we're going to make it, we're not going to, it's not like a punishment, but we're going to show God's power. If she's talking about we being servants of God and bringing the message of salvation, well, what was one of the ways that they confirmed that they were of God? Casting out spirits, performing signs, wonders, and miracles. And so Paul, as we look here, he says in the name of Jesus, or by the authority of Jesus. So again, it's not, he's annoyed, but we're going to do this in the name of God, because it's not my own power that's able to do this. It is by God, by Jesus, that I am able to perform these different things. And we're going to show that we are truly people of God. And as we look, Paul spoke and said, come out of this girl immediately. And as we look, the Spirit came out that very moment. But the people that saw that, they're upset. Why? Moneymaker's gone.
This is not the last time, or this is not, probably not the first time that this has happened. There was another something similar in the Temple of Diana.
Yep.
When
When Paul spoke against that, the idolatry that they were doing in the carving of the silversmith, making all the men,
to Diana,
and they got caught.
he lost several different trades there that was impacted by.
Yep.
That were making money off of idolatry and
Absolutely.
false idols, false worship.
Absolutely. When we see, again, the moneymaker's gone. And again, that creates a commotion there where they trying to get Paul and them out of the city there at that point, with the commotion being so great. But then they eventually have an arbitrator to be able to kind of discuss everything there over what was going on. And these individuals here, they're upset. Our moneymaker's gone. And so what do they do? Because it's important, because we're going to talk about what they do later on here in this chapter. What did they do to Paul and Silas and the others that were accompanying Paul? Yeah, they took them to prison, but what did they also do in the process of prison? They beat them with rods. And they said, these Jews have spoken and done things that are not in our customs here. Now, we could jump ship just for a moment, but what they said was correct. They were Jews. Paul was taught by Jews. They were Jewish individuals, but also, what does Paul have in kind of I guess you could say, the wild card in his pocket?
He's a Roman as well.
He's a Roman as well. It's important for us, just taking quick note of that they had decided to be able to drag them out, to beat them. These magistrates decided to do such things. It wasn't the masters at that point, but they had others, because that's the other thing, is that they could not try to punish any individual without the consent of Rome. They needed to be able to have that, because if they were trying to create all these different things and they were caught by Rome, that's what's going to happen to them. Executed, most likely.
Notice the charge of you're violating Roman stuff.
Yeah.
Cut off the religion out of Rome.
Yeah, the customs of Rome here have been violated as we look at this. So Paul, as Brother Wayne mentioned as well, after they had drugged them out, after they had beaten them, they laid stripes on them as well. They threw them into prison. Into an inner prison.
Yeah, way down.
Yep. Funny enough, I have my good friend, David Padfield. He is a gospel preacher up on the border of Illinois and Wisconsin. He's a faithful preacher. He's taken several trips over into Europe and Asia Minor, I exact one, but they have some of the different ones of what the Philippian prison, Philippian jail looked like. Now again, we're just looking at the X part, because, some of you, well, I don't know, when they think of prison, they still kind of think of a more structured like what we have today. But a jail, a prison, was like a hole in the ground. They carved it out and then kind of did a tunnel system to kind of go deeper and deeper in prison. For those that were more prominent, as you mentioned, Brother Wayne, about inner prison. Those that were more dangerous, according to some, they put them deeper into prison. That way they have a harder time to escape. Now there's usually a few soldiers inside there, and then they have some on the outskirts. So just kind of putting it into perspective. Here you got one of them, got the hole cut out, kind of stoned up, and then here's what one of the prisons look like just on the outskirts of one of the less threatening individuals that have to be there. Just kind of put this in perspective that Paul is introduced and put into prison, but also we're going to see what happens to him with that Philippian jailer and the conversion account there as time allows us next week. Does anybody have any other comments, questions, anything they want to add to our discussion this morning? If not, we'll go ahead and stop there. We'll pick up with verse 25, Lord willing, next week, and we'll look at the conversion of the Philippian jailer and some of the other events that take place here, because one of the things that I want to kind of focus on especially is verse 25 as we begin looking at this study of what Paul and Silas were doing and why it's also important for us to engage in singing. And we'll look at that, Lord willing, next week. Thank you, everyone.